If you've ever believed that courage only comes from perfect weapons, perfect plans, and perfect people, hit subscribe right now, because this story will shatter that belief in the next few minutes. And by the end, you'll understand why millions of Americans who heard this tale said it changed how they saw strength, sacrifice, and what it truly means to fight. Because on a dusty battlefield where cameras rolled and commanders watched, they handed her a broken rifle as a joke, a test, maybe even a quiet sentence. And what she did next stunned everyone watching in ways no one could have scripted. Because the morning the rifle was pressed into her hands, the sun was barely climbing over the jagged hills, light slicing through smoke that never fully cleared anymore. And her name was Lena Carter, a name that meant nothing to the brass and less than nothing to the men who whispered when she passed. Because she was the smallest in the unit, because she was the only woman assigned to this forward combat team, because she had arrived as a late replacement when another soldier broke his leg 2 weeks earlier, and because rumors followed her like shadows, rumors that she was only there because someone high up owed her father a favor, rumors that she'd wash out the first time things went loud, and Lena had learned long ago not to fight rumors with words, because words were cheap in a place where every sound could get you killed. So she kept her head down, checked her gear, and did her job, with a quiet intensity that unsettled people more than boasting ever could. And when Sergeant Hale called her forward that morning, his mouth twisted into a grin that didn't reach his eyes, and the rifle he held out to her looked normal at first glance. Standard issue, scuffed metal, dust in the grooves. But when she took it, the weight felt wrong, the balance off, and she didn't need to pull the bolt more than once to know the firing pin was damaged, the action sticking just enough to turn a life-saving tool into a liability. And a few of the men snickered, low and mean, because they knew, and the camera crew knew too, embedded journalists catching footage for a segment meant to show the human side of the war. And Hale said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You're up front today, Carter." And there it was, the test disguised as an order, the unspoken message that if she failed, it wouldn't be the broken rifle's fault. And Lena met his eyes for half a second, not long enough to be called defiance, just long enough to say she understood exactly what was happening. And she nodded once, slung the rifle, and moved to her position, because what none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that Lena Carter had grown up fixing what other people threw away, that her childhood wasn't framed by trophies or applause, but by the metallic smell of her mother's auto shop in rural Ohio, where broken engines lined the walls like skeletons, and nothing was ever replaced if it could be repaired, where her mother had taught her that tools didn't fail people, people failed tools by not understanding them. And when Lena was 12, her uncle had come back from his second deployment with a limp and a box of disassembled firearms he couldn't bear to look at anymore. And Lena had learned each piece by touch, learned how springs spoke when they were tired, how metal complained before it cracked. And she'd learned something else too, something far more important, which was how to stay calm when everyone around you was shouting that something couldn't be fixed. So as the patrol moved out, boots crunching over gravel and tension rising with every step, Lena's mind wasn't on the whispers or watched the screen in her quiet living room and smiled, because she recognized those hands. And then the twists began. Because with attention came scrutiny, and scrutiny dug up things people weren't supposed to know, like the fact that the rifle hadn't broken by accident, that an internal review quietly launched after the incident found discrepancies in equipment logs, and that Sergeant Hale's name appeared more than once where it shouldn't have. And Lena was called in, not for praise, but for questioning. And for the first time, the system she trusted put her in a room with men in clean uniforms, asking whether she'd tampered with her own weapon for attention. And that hurt more than the laughter ever had, because it told her exactly how fragile respect could be. And she answered calmly, truthfully, describing the damage, the fix, the shots she took. And when they asked why she hadn't reported the faulty rifle immediately, she said something that would later be quoted in headlines. Something simple and devastating, which was that she'd been taught not to expect fairness, only responsibility. And that answer split the room, because some heard defiance and others heard honesty, and the investigation dragged on, and Lena was sidelined, benched from patrols while whispers returned, louder now, because success without permission always made enemies. And then another ambush happened, this one worse, this one without cameras, and a unit Lena knew was pinned down with casualties, mounting, and command hesitated, calculating risk. And Lena listened from the edge of the tent as radio chatter crackled with fear, and something in her snapped. Not anger, not pride, but clarity. And she stepped forward and said she could get them out. And when they asked how, she laid out a plan so unconventional it bordered on insane, using terrain, timing, and a decoy that relied on the enemy underestimating exactly the kind of soldier they'd underestimated her to be. And there was a pause, heavy and electric, and someone said no, and then another voice said yes, and suddenly Lena was moving again. This time, not with a broken rifle, but with a squad that believed in her not because of headlines, but because they'd seen what she could do when things fell apart, and the operation worked. Not perfectly, not without loss, but well enough that men came home who wouldn't have otherwise. And when Lena returned, exhausted and filthy, the investigation ended quietly, because it's hard to call someone reckless when they keep saving lives. And Sergeant Hale was reassigned just as quietly, his career stalled by a line item that never made the news. And Lena was offered commendation she didn't want, interviews she declined, and a chance to become a symbol she refused to be, because symbols were easy to praise and easier to discard. And when her deployment ended, she went home without fanfare, back to Ohio, back to the auto shop, back to broken things that needed fixing, and while the world forgot her, until years later, when a young recruit watched that old footage in a training room and asked an instructor who the soldier was, and the instructor said her name with respect, and told the story not as a miracle, but as a lesson. That sometimes the test isn't whether you can fire when everything works, but whether you can think when everything doesn't. And that's why this story matters, why it still resonates, because they handed her a broken rifle expecting her to break with it. And instead, she showed an entire nation that strength isn't about what you're given, it's about what you do when what you're given is already broken. And if that's the kind of story you want more of, stories that remind you what courage really looks like, subscribe now, because the next one might just change how you see yourself when life hands you something that doesn't work and waits to see what you'll do next. Cameras, or even the rifle's flaw. It was on the terrain, the wind, the way sound carried in the valley ahead. And when the first shot rang out, sharp and unmistakable, the world snapped into focus, like it always did when theory became reality, and chaos erupted, men diving for cover, orders overlapping, dust exploding from the ground as rounds struck close enough to feel like punches, and Lena dropped behind a low wall, heart steady, breath controlled, because fear had never been her enemy. Haste was, and she brought the rifle up, sighted on a distant flash of movement, squeezed the trigger, and felt the dead click of failure, exactly as she expected, and for a split second she heard laughter from somewhere behind her, cut short by another explosion, and that's when the real test began. Because a broken weapon in a firefight wasn't just useless, it was dangerous, and the easy choice would have been to freeze, to shout for a replacement, to wait for someone else to solve the problem. But Lena didn't freeze, because she had already made a decision the moment the rifle touched her hands that morning. A decision not to prove anyone wrong or right, but simply to survive and make sure everyone else did too. And she rolled onto her side, using her body as cover, and stripped the rifle down with movements so smooth they looked rehearsed, hands working by muscle memory as bullets snapped overhead, and someone yelled at her to get her head down, and another voice shouted that she was hit, because from a distance it looked like she'd collapsed, and the camera zoomed in, capturing what would later be replayed in slow motion on news channels across the country. Because instead of retreating, Lena was fixing the weapon under fire, pulling the damaged pin, improvising with a spare part she'd carried since basic training, a part most soldiers threw away because it wasn't on the checklist. And when she snapped the rifle back together, her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline, and she rose just enough to fire. And this time, the rifle roared, solid and true, the recoil grounding her like a promise kept. And the man she targeted went down, and the sound of her shot cut through the noise like a declaration. And suddenly the laughter was gone, replaced by stunned silence and then renewed urgency, because the enemy position was revealed, and Lena didn't stop at one shot. She adjusted, fired again and again, moving with a precision that turned the tide inch by inch, because her shots weren't reckless, they were calculated, buying time, creating space. And when Sergeant Hale realized what was happening, his grin vanished, replaced by disbelief as he shouted for the unit to push forward, and they did, following the opening Lena created. And the firefight ended not with a heroic charge or a dramatic explosion, but with the enemy retreating, melting back into the hills as suddenly as they'd appeared, leaving behind silence broken only by heavy breathing and the distant whir of the camera drone. And when it was over, when the dust settled and the danger receded just enough to think, people started to look at Lena differently, because she wasn't celebrating or posturing. She was cleaning her rifle, checking it like she always did, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And Hale approached her, face tight, and said something that sounded like praise but tasted like apology. And Lena nodded again, because she wasn't there for his approval either. And that should have been the end of it. Just another story from a war full of stories. But it wasn't. Because the footage went home before they did, and editors saw something in it that audiences hadn't seen in a long time. Not just bravery, but competence under contempt. And when the segment aired, Americans watched as commentators replayed the moment the rifle failed, the moment Lena went down, the moment she stood back up firing, and social media exploded with arguments, praise, anger, and disbelief. Because some said it was staged, others said it was reckless, and veterans weighed in to say they'd never seen anything like it. And somewhere in Ohio, Lena's mother,